Hello, and thank you for joining us for our chat today, which is, I'm really appreciative of you being here. We've got a fantastic panel who I'll introduce in a moment, and obviously the topic is betting big on bio and biotech and biology in general. So it should be a good discussion if you're interested in that. Just quickly to introduce our panel, we have Liz Dallymore at the end. Liz is the CEO and Managing Director of Argenica Therapeutics, a listed Australian drug discovery company, developing therapies for stroke, neurological conditions. She's the co-founder and executive chair of a startup medical device company, Inspiring Holdings, which is making inhaled drug delivery, and sits on the board of BioTech, our peak industry body. She was a winner in the Women in Technology Awards and selected as one of 25 Australian female leaders in STEM in 2022. She holds a PhD in neuroscience, completed at Oxford and University of WA, and an MBA in Innovation and Technology from the Graduate School of Management. So welcome, Liz. You can do that if you like. In between, the thorn between the roses is Reid Jobs. Reid and his team launched Yosemite in August 2023 to make cancer non-lethal in our lifetime, an incredible mission. Yosemite works in late-stage academic research and for-profit company creation to invest in the most promising science from across the world and to achieve this mission. Prior to starting Yosemite, Reid was the Managing Director of Health at Emerson Collective for 8 years. He holds a BA in History and International Security and MA in History, both from Stanford University. Welcome, Reid. And last but not least, Alice Zhang. Alice is the CEO and co-founder of Verge Genomics. Verge uses artificial intelligence to develop better drugs faster for diseases like ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. Alice has been recognised for her work in Forbes 30 Under 30, the MIT Tech Review's Innovators Under 35, the San Francisco Business Times 40 Under 40, and Business Insider's 2023 feature of 30 people under 40 that are transforming healthcare. She sits on the board of directors at the California Life Sciences Association and spent 5 years in the UCLA Caltech MD PhD program and received her BA degree from Princeton in molecular biology. She's also an angel investor and advisor to tech-enabled startups. So welcome all three of you, and thank you so much for being here. So betting big on bio, what do we mean? So there's been a lot of innovation in tech and AI. It's sort of defining many pieces of our lives, how we communicate and consume information. But we're ultimately biological organisms, and we interact with a lot of biological processes. There are challenges facing humanity. Health challenges like cancer obviously remain despite our best efforts. New ones like antimicrobial resistance are emerging. We face food insecurity, infectious disease pandemics, biodiversity loss. There's a lot of biologically driven processes and challenges that face the world, not least of which will also impact climate. Last week we saw Nobel Prizes, fascinatingly, in chemistry for the AlphaFold team who applied AI to identify protein structures, and the physics prize to a team who, frankly, replicated neural networks of our brains in silica. So both owe a bit of thanks to biology, I would posit. But the questions are really, how important is biotechnology? And we'll get straight to them. So I'll start with Alice. Biotech faces its own challenges in this context of global challenges that hopefully biotechnology can be involved in solving. Where do you see the potential of biotech to address some of these global challenges, and what are the main challenges for biotech itself from your point of view?
Well, I would say I think today our society faces two kind of biggest challenges right now. The first, you've probably heard in the news, is really rising drug prices and access to drugs. You know, and a big driver for this is that pharma has undergone this decades-long decline in R&D efficiency that's led to, you know, we've all seen the statistics. It costs on average $2.6 billion to develop a single new drug over 12 years. And a lot of that is because pharma companies are still using essentially guess and check processes to discover new drugs. They use brute force screening. They use mice to try to figure out what works in humans. And while that's worked for simpler diseases, What it doesn't work for is unique, complex diseases that are uniquely human. And what that means is really their whole set of incurable diseases like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, where millions and millions of patients just simply don't have any options. And a lot of pharma companies have abandoned these diseases because they just don't have the tools to really understand the complex biology. And so I think that what's really exciting the last 10 years is that biotech is going through what I call a Moneyball moment right now, where new advances across multiple industry, from physics, from hardware to engineering, are converging. And it's creating really a watershed moment for a new type of pharma company to emerge, but one that is much more data-driven, that has the capacity to actually unlock these diseases that we consider to be incurable, and to do that at scale, much more cheaply and much more quickly. And that's what we've been focused for the last 9 years at Verge for.
Cool. Reid, there's been a lot of progress in oncology specifically, and I know that Yosemite is a cancer-focused fund with an incredible mission. Can you talk to us a little bit about the challenges you see there and the opportunities coming up in the future to solve some of the biggest problems?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having us here. It's an incredibly interesting period for biotechnology, as Alice was just talking about. And not only is this about the emergence of a lot of new technological modalities, whether that's what AI is enabling, what we're seeing on the immunology side, on the gene editing side, and on the data really aggregation side, what we're really the most excited about from our perspective is really following what is the cutting edge of biology right now and extrapolating that really probably 2 or 3 decades out. So what we see that we are really, really excited about is the long-term optimization of immunotherapy to tackle most solid tumors. Now, there's a few ways to do this through small molecules and through engineered cell therapies. And right now we've had incredible successes in what you could say are lower hanging fruits, so cancers that are highly mutagenic or hematological that don't have solid tumors like leukemias and lymphomas. Now, optimizing this to get into efficacy where you see what you see in melanoma and in leukemia to lung cancer and breast cancer is really where we're going to be focusing all of our energy for the next couple decades.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's Liz, you're a neuroscientist, so moving on from cancer, you've got a lot of perspectives on mental health, and we've had a lot of discussions about CNS diseases and mental health situations. So maybe you could talk about what you've seen, particularly in the last decade, in terms of drivers in mental health, but also the impact of COVID, which seemed to provide a bit of a tailwind to some of these.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the first thing I'll say about neuro is that it's really challenging. And Alice, you can probably concur. It's a fascinating area of science, but it has been historically really challenging. I used to teach neuroscience to med students, and I used to always say the brain is like a black box, right? It's the one organ where we look down the microscope and it's really hard to actually look at the anatomy of the organ and really decipher what the function of it is. But that's why I loved it. I was like, this is so fascinating. But what we have now is technology. So I think the thing that's really fascinating about neuroscience now is that we can image the brain better. We've now got human cells that we can work on, human neurons, human astrocytes, that we can actually, as to Alice's point, move away from those animal models. We have human tissue, which we can actually study drugs in Alzheimer's disease. So those sorts of things are really cool. I guess from what we're doing in the clinic, one of the biggest challenges with neuroscience is that people often present very, very differently. So we can now actually use AI and imaging modalities. If we look at mental health, one of the big things that we know now is that people actually respond and metabolize drugs very, very differently in mental health. So we can screen patients with pharmacogenetics and high throughput screening much quicker than we can. And we can actually tailor the way that these drugs are dosed and delivered to these patients, we really are on the precipice of that intersection between, I think, technology, both imaging, pharmacogenetics, genetic editing, all these things that are really just accelerating. So there's challenges, yes. Putting a drug in the clinical trial is challenging, but I just think the opportunities in bio at the moment, it's a really exciting place to be.
And what I find so interesting is that at the same time that all of these technologies are breaking through with increasing pace in neuroscience, a lot of the pharma companies are exiting neuroscience. They're completely abandoning it. A lot of the incumbents are leaving. Yet at the same time, Alzheimer's disease is the only disease in the top 10 where there are increasing and growing death rates. So when you get this confluence of a massive market with unmet patient need, with increasing technology and a technological renaissance in incumbents leaving the space, that's exactly the kind of formula. That's why I call it a Moneyball moment, when I think it creates space for smaller companies to really make huge breakthrough strides, essentially while pharma companies aren't looking.
You've all touched on technologies a little bit. Just the last 5 years in particular, infectious diseases and pandemics, so there certainly can't be not on anyone's mind as to what's coming next. The story of mRNA and vaccines was an interesting story, and from my understanding, Moderna was largely working on oncology applications and wasn't doing too well, actually, with the oncology vaccines at the time, but essentially allowed a speed to address an infectious disease, in this case a virus, and a delivery mechanism. Can you just talk a little bit about the tech, whether it's mRNA tech and vaccines or any tech that you see as really going to be applied into areas we perhaps haven't thought about next specifically? Any one of you?
Oh, well, one of my favorite areas is cancer vaccines. And I guess there's two types of cancer vaccines. First of all, there's vaccines for diseases that are promotive of cancer. And usually that's a couple viruses where there's a clear etiology, and that's things like hepatitis and HPV. But the real vision, and this is not a new idea, by the way, this has been around for about 100 years, is what if you could prime your body's immune system to identify cancer in the earliest stages as a foreign object, and then eliminate it in situ, which is what your body does actually all day, every day. It would just be optimizing it. The trick has always been that cancer, particularly again, relative to infectious diseases, is very similar to you genetically. When you get infected with a virus, it looks very, very different. So no one's ever been able to really get it right from a selectivity perspective. That's distilling down about 100 years of biology right there. And mRNA vaccines are an entirely new modality for cancer vaccines. And recently, as this has been reapplied, you're seeing results that are completely novel. So the one that really blows me away is late last year, BioTech and Memorial Sloan Kettering had a phase 1 of 12 patients for pancreatic cancer. It was odd that they did pancreatic cancer because it's one of the most difficult. And they initially showed a 50% clinical response. Now, it's a phase 1, it's a tiny sample size, and some of those, I believe, actually subsequently recurred. But seeing that signal is incredibly rare, and it really showed the whole field that this is an area that is going to have a lot more acceleration and just a lot more potential in the next couple of years. So I would just say everyone is now leaning into vaccines in a way that we haven't seen probably for about 50 years.
Fantastic. You touched on something there which is sort of the belief in or the hype, frankly. Biotech's often perceived as being a bit overhyped, or it has been in the past, in terms of people talk cures in cancer, which gets you into trouble. There's a lot of hype around AI and technology. I mean, it feels like somehow AI and drug development is wine and cheese at the moment. As an investor, everything I see pretty much in every health tech or biotech pitch, usually, someone's trying to attach at the last minute AI to an idea that doesn't necessarily need it. So you get sort of this tarring of the brush of hype. So maybe you guys, and I'll start with Alice here because this is probably, sorry, I started with Alice last time. I'll start with Reid here. So what do you think in oncology? It's a very specific thing. You work with a lot of clinicians, a lot of researchers. There's a credibility issue, I think, as an investor that you have to keep. How do you manage the sort of hype versus reality? You're a very positive person, knowing you, you're very positive about the field and where it's going. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, luckily, me and also Alice, we get to live in the Bay Area. So a lot of the greatest companies that are pioneering this are actually in our backyard. So we get a lot of access to, frankly, operators at those companies, which really matters to be just honest about where the state of the art is. So we've been through plenty of hype cycles in my career, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more to come. So staying really close to where the actual state of the art is on the ground level of these companies is quite invaluable to me, because many other investors are a little hallucinatory about what the value of this really is, and I just think we have a much more informed perspective. We are very excited about some of the applications, particularly about patient segmentation for clinical trials, which is very real and happening right now. Drug discovery for particularly undruggable niches or with a lot of new drug libraries. That's work that honestly isn't, I wouldn't call it transformative, but it's accelerative. And it's really just cheapening the process of this by orders of magnitude, which is very, very valuable. And I'm also just excited about some blue sky applications. It's a very powerful new tool, and thinking about what that can be in 10 years is very exciting.
Yeah, I think it really requires you to take the long view. We've been around for 9 years. When I first started at the company, I was laughed out of many rooms for even mentioning artificial intelligence. The number of times, frankly, I've had to scrub our deck of the word AI and then reintroduce it. So it's not the first time we've been through a hype cycle. I think the thing that I think firstly, one thing to be excited about is we're starting to see real drug products coming into clinical trials from companies like ours and other AI companies. The thing I think we need to be mindful of is when we have a tendency to build up a technology, we also have a predisposition to really wanting to tear it down. And I think that never in the history of any great technology has been the first attempt been the smashing success. Technology development is always iterative, it builds on itself. And I think what we need to be careful about is if there's a first setback, that we don't fall into the trap of, schadenfreude of saying, hey, we told you so, AI doesn't work. Just because we had a setback, that means the technology doesn't work. I think we need to take the mindset of saying, hey, this is a technology that will build upon itself, and setbacks are just as valuable as successes if we take the mindset of learning from them instead of having a black and white approach to things. I think in terms of areas I'm most excited about, to disagree with Reed, I think one of the areas that we've learned in drug discovery is there's this kind of focus on looking at, he mentioned undruggable targets, and really this thing that, if technology came in, there are all these targets out there that if only we had the magical technology piece to drug them, then we could really unlock all diseases. And I think the last 5 years, what people have found is that space is actually smaller than we expected, and it's highly competitive. And so there's this shifting in perception of where is actually the biggest transformative space that AI can play in. In our view, it's really finding out what is the white space of what are targets we don't know about yet, what are the causes of disease that we don't know about yet, because frankly, the complexity of these diseases exceeds the limits of human cognition. And so those are the areas where we're most excited about at Verge.
Likewise. Liz, you're in a special position, CEO of a listed Australian company, but also founder of a private startup. You have to navigate this line of overhyping something versus generating interest and airtime, with investors and capital. Can you talk to this a little bit?
Yeah, and I guess it's really hard as a CEO, especially of a listed company where everything we do is hyping. Right? So we're trying to hype the market, but as Reed was saying, I have an expectation of investors to also do their homework. I'm really fortunate that I run a company that has huge amounts of published data, so it's quite easy, hopefully, for an investor to come in and see that, hopefully the hype is real. But it is and you see it time and time again in listed companies, and I see CEOs sort of standing up on stage and they've got one rat study and it's the next cure for Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. And people buy into that, right, because they're massive unmet needs. So, and there is that distinction between, obviously, the hype that you see not in the industry or people that are really familiar with the industry, and the hype that potentially, I saw an article in The Australian, I think a drug coming out of Queensland University, again, one rat study, but apparently it cured strokes. So, it's hard for the layperson to sort of see through that. And you're probably referring also to Theranos. We all know Theranos. There was a lot of hype around that. I think it did probably a lot of damage, especially to the diagnostic industry in biotech as well. So it's easy to hype a story, but really you've got to dig into what's that hype about. In terms of things coming through that I think warrant hype, I was really fortunate to be part of the research institute that developed the first antisense oligonucleotide for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And this is really where gene editing, precision medicine can play a massive role. You know, these boys had a life expectancy of 12, 13, 14 years. These boys are now living into their 20s, 30s, having a much more fulfilled life. It's so rewarding, and that's where I think the hype needs to come from. The actual game-changing technologies, you know, AI finding novel targets, these gene editing, this CRISPR, these antisense oligonucleotides, it's really, really exciting.
Yeah, and I think sometimes because of the fear of overhype, we don't celebrate some of the wins. I know that happens in oncology with some of the rare cancers and stuff that have been, well, melanoma is not a rare cancer, but there's some of the sarcomas and stuff and some of the blood cancers where there's just been phenomenal progress. Any opinions on how we actually get the word out on the successes, you know, of biotechnology a bit better? Sometimes they just seem to come and go, and the whole field changes for a particular group of patients, real people who now have vastly different lives, and we're not necessarily talking about it, or people don't know those stories.
I think it's a hard one, right? Because big pharma is sometimes a dirty word as well. So there's the commercial element of obviously what we're doing here, which is so important. You need to understand, you know, how a drug is going to make money. That's just the reality of what we do. So that is challenging, I always find, to sort of, you know, to manage that. Even, you know, my PhD supervisor always tells me, you went to the dark side. I was like, but I've actually got a drug that is being dosed in stroke patients. Like, isn't that what we're all sort of here to do? Is like, oh, but you're going to make money and you're going to do a deal with big pharma. So I find that sort of quite, it sort of dilutes these really positive personal stories around, you know, just what we're doing with these drugs, these technologies, and the actual impact of patient lives. I'm not sure how you get that messaging out, and sort of get rid of the noise of the commercial side.
It's interesting. I worked for what people would call big pharma for a decade. I now run a small investment company. You know, this idea, and a big part of Tenmile's focus is building an ecosystem that's around collaboration and partnerships. And I often see situations where if people could just open up to industry and pharma and not see them as the wolf at the door or somehow evil, there would be a lot better, a lot more progress, which sort of segues to collaborations and partnerships, you know, more generally. So, Liz, can you talk to us a little bit about the role of partnerships and collaborations in your experience, in your companies, but also how you've seen it helped Australian biotech in particular, which is sort of, we are isolated, yep, and we are a small population relatively, in terms of we need those Nobel Prizes were both teams that were multinational and brought together experts using different fields and, you know, to really crack an innovation or to crack a problem. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's probably a reasonably different sort of experience. I think we run, in particular, drug development companies in Australia quite differently to how they run them in the US. And I'm Perth-based, so I'm even more isolated than the norm. But we, I guess at Argenica and also at Inspiring and some work I've done with other biotech companies, we absolutely rely on collaborations. So we do a lot of preclinical work with university collaborators. That is what Australia does extremely well. We have fantastic research institutes here and really punch above our weight in terms of the quality of the early stage R&D that's done here. But we are essentially a global company, right? So we've got CROs based across Europe, we do our manufacturing in Italy, we've got KOLs based in the US, our clinical advisory committee based in the US, through UCLA, we have to do that. But what I've seen work, I guess, really well, so probably two of the recent success stories in Australian biotech is Telix. They have a radiopharmaceutical business, and then Neuron Pharmaceutical, which is a rare pediatric neurology drug that has recently received FDA approval. So Telix did really well in terms of doing a partnership with China, with China Gram Pharmaceuticals, and just seeing the actual, I guess, the projection of that company, looking at what what Australia has on its doorstep. I think we miss that a little bit in Australia. We always go, US market, European market, and really sort of forget about, these huge markets that are in Asia in the same time zone that we could really work with. So at Argenica, I've been speaking very closely with the guy that brokered the deal with Chinese Grand Pharma. I've got the ex-head of China Bayer as my VP of Business Development, and that is an area that we are really focused on, which can be somewhat controversial in terms of talking about China, although something that I think Australians are probably a little bit more familiar with.
Well, it's a huge healthcare market, and it's interesting how many clinical trials. We have a great clinical trial network and set up in Australia. A lot of Asian, Chinese and other Asian countries are trying to come to Australia for phase 1 clinical trials now. Those sort of things are really good ultimately for the ecosystem here. I'm sure you both have examples. AI and tech, computer science, AI with drug development. You're linking two sectors in your whole organisation. It's its thesis.
Yeah, if you think about what we're trying to do, which is build a pipeline of over a dozen breakthrough therapies for the world's biggest challenges using a totally new approach, you would imagine it's impossible to do really as a single entity, and collaborations with academia and industry are part of our lifeblood. Now, our experience over the last 9 years has also given us a lot of insight into really interesting gaps in the market. I think that have led to a lot of inefficiency. And so I'll start with academia. So one of the biggest assets we have at Verge is we have one of the world's largest proprietary data set of human brains and human tissue. So we actually have over 9,000 human brains directly from people that have died from Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, ALS. We've sequenced this all, and we've banked it. We mined that with our AI data sets.
Not in your office, right?
Well.
Halloween's coming up.
Yeah. It's quite spooky sometimes. But to do, how we were able to build this is we capitalize on a decades-long trend of government funding that have increasingly emphasized that human data is really what's needed to drive better drug discovery. But what we found is that the government has spent so much money actually banking these brains, but they haven't been used because academics have been banking them, and there hasn't been really an industry partner that has the expertise both on the computer science and the drug development side to actually go in and who is willing to put in the blood, sweat, and tears. Now, these agreements are very bureaucratic. They're very intense and tedious. And so one of the things we've seen is that there are huge silos right now in data generation that I think the industry has not figured out how we're going to efficiently generate data. So we have companies like ours that generate proprietary data. We don't share it with anyone else because we're venture funded and we need to generate returns from the data. You have academics that generate data, but they're not industry grade. And actually, honestly, they're very hard to access. And so what happens is that companies are reproducing data sets, they're generating their own. If we work with a pharma company, they want exclusivity. And I think the next frontier is how, as an industry, are we going to systematize and democratize data access and generation so that it benefits the patients and not just the monetary interests. We also work with big pharma, so we have 2 big billion-dollar partnerships with AstraZeneca and Lilly. That have honestly been necessary for capitalizing us. Oftentimes, pharma companies see the promise of technology far before VCs. And so that's been half of our funding is through pharma companies. Now, that also has its own challenges. Pharma companies are incentivized very differently from biotechs, and that's oftentimes in and of itself stymied progress as well. So it's definitely a double-edged sword, and we've just learned a lot about, I think, greater centralization that's needed to really become kind of a data-forward industry.
Yeah, It's a great point. I want to come back to data, aggregated data and privacy in a moment, so we'll probably touch on it again. Reid, we were talking yesterday actually, and you mentioned some models around, Australia has this clinical trial ecosystem that's really efficient and actually favours early stage trials and speed into the clinic and stuff. We have an R&D tax rebate that's fantastic, honestly, for early stage companies. And you mentioned linking that to management expertise and fast tracking to the market, which is often the US or to Europe or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about that?
My pleasure, yeah. So one thing we've seen a lot when we work internationally is most biotech companies in Europe or in Asia will need to come to the US for the market share to IPO usually, and access different pools of capital, and frankly to leverage management teams in the US. So as you have often serial managers for biotech companies, founders who are as great as Alice, who stay for the whole time, are rarer. We always love to work with them, but they're just a bit rarer. And what we see particularly with the UK, which is a good analogy here, is companies that get spun out of universities there, say Oxford or Cambridge, will really be sort of brought over to the US pretty much immediately. They maybe stay in the UK for like 6 months and then almost immediately come to Boston. Now, what has happened during COVID is a lot of these companies have actually been set up by necessity in decentralized ways. So you had, say, the lab that started something in Oxford will actually remain in the company where it really is located, though the management will be probably in the US, and that pipeline will be sort of pre-baked from the very inception of that company. Now, this actually is great for the UK because it allows companies to stay there much longer than they otherwise would. I think there's a totally equivalent analogy that you could put for Australia, though more likely with the US West Coast as opposed to the East Coast, but you could keep companies here far longer and actually just leverage your strengths that you'd have here with the universities and CROs, and America's strengths, which are its pool of capital, its large market size, and its experienced management team. So we're seeing a lot of that design, which has really been embraced by a lot of international players. I would say, though, additionally for Australia, the Japanese government, which of course is in the same time zone here, has opened up quite a lot of government funding and actually of university backing to be really promotive of biotech companies. It's something that has actually just happened this past year. It was the former Prime Minister Kishida, who I actually think was just ousted like a few weeks ago. But that party, Liberal Party, has been extremely promotive of that in the Tokyo area. So I would say that's another opportunity that's kind of a little more nascent, but it's something to look at.
So essentially collaborations and those sort of international partnerships are the way to go, and earlier the better, so you can keep some nexus in Australia. And I think that's something we're pretty determined to see. Also to bring US capital to be deployed, particularly US capital to be deployed in Australia, and I think that's got a lot of room for improvement, and it comes from with people getting on planes and stuff, and people like you being here. So thank you for that. Back to data privacy, ethics and risks and biotech, whether it's genetically modified agricultural food, or whether it's people's hugely private genome and their perspective on their genome and their value of their health data, and whether it's going to be shared or abused. What are your thoughts? Maybe Alice, you can start. You were talking about your data sets and these contributed tissue samples and stuff. Certainly when I worked at Roche, there's massive value, and particularly now with AI, in these large health data sets. And yet there still seems to be massive concern in how they're shared. Have you got any advice on whether that's holding us back or how to think about it?
Yeah, I think the biggest concern is really privacy and being able to de-identify data. There was some paper that came out a few years ago actually showing that just based on someone's DNA sequence, you can, to quite a high degree of precision, locate where they are, their address, and their neighborhood, just based on the DNA sequence. So obviously it's a growing concern. It's something that there's increasing amount of regulation. Even with the academics we work with, it's all carefully de-identified. But this is something where we've had to really learn and implement some of these policies quite early to really ensure we're not accidentally contaminating ourselves or invading, being able to determine people's identifying information. I think in general as we zoom out and think about ethical challenges at large with some of these emerging biotechnologies, Liz had mentioned earlier these advances in gene editing and genetic technologies that have developed new curative therapies that haven't been present before. I think it also raises a new challenge of really equity of access to these therapies. So for example, very similar therapy, Biogen in 2019 got a new drug called Spinraza approved, treated this rare form of spinal muscular atrophy that kills children under the age of 2. So these children get paralyzed, they die, and it's really the first treatment. The data were spectacular. These patients were not only living longer, the children were walking, breathing again. However, the cost per patient per year was $2 million. And that was because of the cost of developing the technology and the narrow commercial application. So that's something I think is the new frontier, is how do we actually think about, it's not just about having a new technology, it's about who are the patients that can access it, how can we lower the price for these patients, and how can we access a much larger demographic so that we can lower the drug prices.
I think, sorry, just on that point, so one, I guess, very tangible example of that ASO technology I mentioned before, which was developed in a Perth Research Institute, deal done with Sarepta Therapeutics in the US, and doing amazing things for those Duchenne boys, is not available in Australia. And those sorts of that inequity in terms of access is a real challenge in smaller markets like Australia, where you've got even less patients, and so from a commercial point of view, it's not even worth coming here. But it's sad, right? It's sad that an amazing technology developed in Australia isn't able to be accessed here.
I would say something that my team and I think a lot is how data liquidity operates on a patient level on their experience in the US healthcare system, which, lucky for you, is not what you have in Australia. But in the US, there's really, really high friction and barriers of entry to actually transporting patients' data between hospitals, even if you are that patient. And this goes back to how privacy is interpreted, but it's particularly at the root of it is how basically companies that provide electronic records have an incentive to balkanize that and keep patients within hospital systems for the sake of those hospital systems' bottom lines. And that just creates a really, really difficult environment with regard to patients transporting their data between hospitals and actually patients directly to companies. There's a lot that we are doing in terms of, clinical records that could be accessed directly by patients, liquidity portals that are both facing physicians and facing patients. But in the US, it's a major issue right now, and it's quite complicated.
It is a major issue, and I struck it in oncology at Roche, where essentially we surveyed cancer patients, who consent their data for research, and they believe that they're contributing their data for research, and it actually gets into the hospital where they're treated and then hung up. To your exact point,
yeah.
it falls into a silo, and if you talk to the patient, they actually believe they consented it, and it's going to be used to help the disease and aggregate it and all that, and it's not. It's actually stuck in the hospital, and no one else can get access to it. So it remains a really big issue, I think, for healthcare R&D and ultimately innovation of new medicines.
It is. Cancer, unfortunately, is the worst here because it is the most complex. So you have to see all these different specialists, and often, various specialists are outside of your hospital system and have their own data, particularly with radiologists is the big one, where you need to get a scan and you have to go to another provider. That might not be integrated with your health record in the hospital that you're being treated. So it's crazily balkanized. Now, what you're seeing happen is a lot of private companies are aggregating this externally. There's a big company called Tempus doing this. Foundation Medicine did aspects of this, and then with Flatiron, when Roche bought all those, they kind of brought them together. So you're seeing companies do this really to leverage data for clinical trial optimization for maybe some drug discovery work. That's frankly, I think, been a little less lucrative for them than they were hoping, but it's now being done really outside by private companies.
Yeah. Very quickly then on funding for biotech, and sort of access to capital and stuff. There are very different models, VC being just one relatively small one. So Alice, how do you think we should be prioritising funding in biotech? And is venture capital, just focusing on venture capital for the moment, focused on the right things?
Well, we've had a really interesting and unique funding journey. When I first started the company 9 years ago, I was, again, you'd go into a biotech VC and they say, scientists can't start companies. You're young, you don't look like the typical CEO that I see. That is to say, I'm not an old white man from Pfizer. And so I think, no offense. But I think it's a reflection on the current biotech funding model, which I think has really lagged behind the pace of innovation that's really happening. And to give some context, the traditional way that biotech companies are funded are that VCs typically go out, they find the most promising ideas in academic labs, they license out those ideas, they bring in an experienced management team, usually kind of mid to late career executives from pharma companies, to really execute, and they own the majority of the company. That's just how biotech companies have been run for the last X number of years, and it really actually in a lot of ways reflects what tech VC looked like 50 years ago. Now, that model has two problems. The first is not scalable. So as an example, while the tech ecosystem has really grown over the last 10 years, if you look at the number of companies formed in biotech, it's actually gone down over the last 5 years. Secondly, the world is different now. I would say in biotech, we're not only facing decreasing and compressing technology cycles, but there's really a new breed of companies that are emerging that are next generation biotechs based on ambitious technology platforms or breakthroughs. And that calls for a totally different model of company formation, a totally different phenotype. So while, more experienced operators may be useful for minimizing operational risks, when you have ambitious technological hurdles ahead of you where the playbook hasn't been written, I think we can all appreciate in tech that naivete and youth and technological founders have an advantage, and that just hasn't yet been recognized in biotech. And so while in tech, they've created these incredible supportive ecosystem for young founders, and in biotech, they've created great platforms for more experienced execs to transition into biotech. There really right now is not infrastructure in biotech for young technologist founders to go out there and start companies, and I think that's why more companies aren't being formed. But I think that will change in the next 5 years, just because it's inevitable. I think technology is moving so quickly that even I get pinged probably 10 times more now by a young PhD or postdoc that's coming out and starting their own company. And I think it's just a matter of time before investors need to adopt. And frankly, I think the ones that adopt more quickly are going to win. The ones that don't will be left behind.
Yeah, excellent. And great examples like Verge and yourself. Reid, you have a very interesting model that sort of combines venture capital with early research funding and grants, essentially, or non-dilutive capital. Can you just talk to that a little bit as a way to incent very early development before you get all tangled up in equity and in investments and returns?
Sure. And I was also just thinking about what Alice was saying there. It is a really interesting time right now in the biotech landscape. I'm sure right now there's fewer companies than there were in 2021. That's, in my view, probably a good thing, because that was really just an insanely frothy moment for us, and there was a lot of, frankly, just dumb investments that were made by people in really overvalued companies in a way that has made everyone look quite poor. Biotech has historically been by far the most volatile major sector in the tech world, outperforming the XBI, or actually outperforming NASDAQ, but just like ridiculously spiky if you look at it over a 10-year period. So it's not really a surprise that there's a bit of an overcorrection now and there's a total pullback. Unfortunately, I think Alice is right about the operator model. The biggest fundraise privately this year has been a company called Zera, which had a old Genentech guy who's actually really good, but does fit that profile of yours and is a little bit of it's more of a conservative play. Now, something that we've noticed a lot in our model is we tend to work with academics in the earliest stages of company creation. So, if you look at, if you think about, VCs operating from kind of company creation, company growth, and then later stage, we're really in the first two, but quite heavily weighted in the first one. We're really, really at the point of inception at universities. And something we've noticed that is really, I think, a generational change is, unlike tech, the big difference between tech and biotech is you rarely have a founder CEO. you often have a founder and then a different CEO. And these are the mercenaries that Alice is referring to. But the founders are usually academics who tend to, have a tenured position and, have a lot of things that they're working on and not necessarily want to leave to run one of those in a company. Usually they'll stay in a lab and license these things out. That is really changing as a model. This is my own supposition, but I think that particularly people of my generation who are coming into academia are a lot less induced by wanting to have a long-term tenured position. They got into this because they wanted to solve a problem. Usually it's a personal reason, but they focused on disease because they wanted to figure something out and they wanted to help patients. Generally, they want to actually go into companies to do that. So there's a really big cultural change that's happening with academics becoming more like old school tech founders and actually leaving academia to be CEOs of their own companies. That's a very new trend, and it's one that I really hope to see a lot more of, but it's a really big change in the ecosystem.
Yeah, Liz, Australia's a little different, I think, after
Very
coming
different.
back after 20 odd
Yeah.
years in the US. Can you just talk to the Australian landscape, which is interesting for me because it feels like there's quite a lot of state and federal government funding for, not just for research, primary research, but actually for early stage companies.
Yeah.
But it's a bit of a double-edged sword because there's a sort of cliff that they fall off when they try to access private capital or venture capital.
Yeah.
You probably lived that.
Yes.
Can you talk to that a little
Yes.
bit?
And having, I guess, sort of two perspectives of, I guess, founding two quite different companies, a device company that's still private and a drug development company where the founders are still both involved. One heavily involved, a respiratory clinician who can be the bane of my existence. It can be very, very challenging sometimes to work with these founders. And the other who is our CSO in Argenica, who is just fantastic. So never wanted to run a company, but very, very different funding models in Australia to the US. We lack VC. So Argenica actually listed in 2021, which was great because there was a bit of, a massive boom in biotech. Our share price went from sort of 20 cents to $1 in the space of a couple of months off preclinical data, which is very odd. It has had a recorrection though. But we really, when we spun Argenica out of the parent institute, we got some seed funding, but it was really, really difficult to get investors to buy in unless there was a very near-term liquidity event, being an IPO. So we were sort of forced, and drug development is obviously expensive, so we were forced to essentially to list that company very early on, and that comes with all sorts of challenges. The ability to raise capital is quick and potentially easier, but I guess just the compliance and the transparency that you have and the news flow management and the shareholder management that kind of comes with that is quite distracting as a CEO that's really just trying to get your drug development program through. On the flip side, in terms of our private company, not having a near-term liquidity event, looking at, taking this device through to FDA approval has been really challenging, actually, like a really hard slog to actually get that sort of kind of private. Very difficult for VC because it wasn't the massive blue sky. It's quite a cool, novel, but quick to develop device. So we kind of relied on family offices, and that just takes time because in Australia they have no idea about biotech. And what I found really weird, so I think, there's actually no shortage of capital in Australia, especially in WA, where there's a lot of mining billionaires. But when I would talk to these people and sort of say, look, we've got this amazing technology. It's spun out of these great research institutes in Perth, and it can really have an impact on changing lives. Their preference was to fund the research institutes. So the idea of funding a company to make a profit from healthcare was really foreign to them, and something that just doesn't sit well, which I find bizarre because I'm always saying unless you've got a shareholder actually driving you, researchers can spin their wheels in research, right? If they're happy, if they're tenured and they're sitting there and they're just getting their government grants year on year, it doesn't actually drive patient translation. So how do we change that narrative in Australia? That's something that is very challenging.
By the way, I think that's what you were talking about earlier is definitely a dynamic in the US. I think it's probably the biggest funding gap in VC right now is, in the Series A, there's a lot of investors, love the big vision, love the long-term story of the platform. as you evolve into Series C+, there's not really a path for companies like ours. Most biotech companies will IPO, they'll do a crossover IPO, and then investors are really looking at how do I get a return in the next 1 to 2 years off of a new clinical trial data card flip off of the lead program. And so what happens is a lot of promising platform companies get killed because their first program, their first drug, has a clinical trial failure, and there's not an investor segment there that's really willing to back the 5 to 10 year vision. And so I think that's definitely something that needs to be fleshed out more in the next few years, is this new category of companies that doesn't look like your traditional biotech company, it doesn't look like your traditional tech company, it has a 5 to 10 year transformative time horizon. How do we get funding to really see more promising drugs through and really see the value of these platforms, not at the Series A stage, but really at the Series C, D, keeping them private for a longer stage?
Yeah. Any word on funding? No. Well, that's it for formal questions. I wanted to go to the audience, and we actually got a few more minutes than we had been originally told. So we have time to take audience Q&A. So there's going to be a couple of microphones coming around, and if you've got a question for any of the panelists or any of us, please jump in now. I'll take a question from every one of you by the look of it. That was a joke.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for your time and sharing your invaluable insights. I guess open to each of you to answer. How do you, given the work you're doing and the incredible impact it drives, how do you define impact before you make that decision on what you're going to do, what you're going to back, or what you're going to build? How do you individually define impact?
Great question. Who's up?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. It's something we frankly discuss on an almost daily basis. So whenever we're looking at a company, first of all, it has to make financial sense if it's an investment. We care about getting to patients and scalability, and we do a lot of nonprofit, but if we're looking at a company, obviously we're looking at a company. We really like things that have really first-in-class or novel modalities that are either a new biological mechanism, or they're going after a really hard-to-hit drug, or maybe a really rare or overlooked patient population where the standard of care is really, really poor. We tend to be extremely wary, and we eschew a lot of incremental work that might be a improvement on something, or it's like a combination with something else. Those are a lot less interesting to us, frankly, because they probably will be funding, and if they're successful, the advancement is maybe very, very moderate. So we tend to be quite bold in how large we try to go. And I just want to say those are always the funnest companies, of course, are ones that are maybe going to transform something like, a epigenetic care or whole disease, or a new diagnostic platform for something that's never been able to be tested before. Those are really why you get excited about this job, I think.
I would say, I think the really interesting and challenging part of my job is really linking the patient impact with the practicalities of getting money to execute on it. And I'll never forget, actually, the highlight of my 9 years at Verge was in 2022. We dosed our first human with a drug from our AI platform, and I got the chance to fly to Amsterdam where we were doing the clinical trials. And it was the first moment that I saw, literally it was a physical pill. And it was just 8 years of blood, sweat, and tears collapsed into this single pill that I could hold in my hand. And I watched the first person take that drug. And it's a moment that I refer back to every day when I need to go to an Excel spreadsheet for the 1,000th time, or followed up with an investor who's ghosting me. And I really just remember that moment. I think that's what drives the company. Now, the challenge in terms of deciding where you invest is really then how do we get the money, and how do we make this pitch of this being a great return for people as well as a great impact? And that really is, I could spend an hour talking about it, but that's really where we think about, okay, when we buy this type of data set, what is actually the commercial, what's the path to market, what's the commercial market, how is an investor going to view this? Can we really put ourselves, and this has been key, can I put myself literally in that investor's shoe, in that seat? What are they worried about? What are they caring about? And then equally, can I put myself in the seat of a patient, of an ALS patient that has 1 year to live? What are they thinking about? What are they worrying about? And that diversity of really thinking about impact is what's so rewarding about the job.
I think, yeah, to that point, it's kind of impact for who, right? So I think, you know, as scientists that become CEOs, I hope that we're all in it for patient impact, right? But we do have to think about shareholder value all the time. So what are the decisions that we're making in the company ultimately that are going to drive shareholder value? But I see that they have a direct link with patient impact, right? So if you can look at doing something, you know, running your clinical program faster, cheaper, with innovative trial design, adaptive trial design, moving things forward, you're going to save the company money, you're going to have greater shareholder value, but you're going to have quicker, hopefully, that drug to market and greater patient impact. So they are ultimately intertwined, but I think ultimately, you know, for me personally, my biggest driver is patient impact, absolutely.
I'll just add one investor perspective quickly, which is we're a health tech VC, right, in Australia. There's a lot of VCs in Australia that are all tech and everything. And I find that even as a health tech VC with that narrower thing and you know, a decent amount of money to invest, that we have to strategically go after areas of focus. So we have areas like antimicrobial resistance, which is very important for us and our founders. It's an area that's not heavily invested in by pharma. It's a bit of a graveyard because you can develop incredibly expensive drugs that cost a fortune to make, and they get put on the shelf as an agent of last reserve, you know, for AMR. But it's an incredibly potentially impactful area that is needed. But we have a series of strategic themes that we invest against within health tech, and I think that helps us feel like we can actually generate impact within those areas.
Hi, I'm Madison here from UNSW Founders. I run a biotech accelerator supporting early stage biotech companies. What tech transfer offices have you worked with around the world that have been a delight to work with, and what can Australia learn?
A delight.
A delight to work with. Mic drop. Don't get me on this subject. Reid, I'm going to throw you under the bus.
Thanks. In Israel, by far, Israeli universities have a structure that is, as far as I've encountered, quite unique, where the TTO is not actually part of the university. It's this quasi-independent venture organization where they actually try to take equity instead of royalties with companies. It's a very interesting model. So as a VC, if you go there, they're incredibly excited to work with you and aren't trying to like haggle. They're actually just trying to get as many companies out the door as they possibly can. It's, of course, not perfect, but it's frankly just more like industrially friendly model. Though my favorite TTOs are just ones who support their great researchers, and when you know, companies want to get spun out of there, they're just quite abiding and will follow where researchers want to go. And
I think if researchers and academics are singing the praises of their own TTO, that's a very good sign. The times you see that is very, very rare. Right? So, you know, essentially when the TTO becomes an agent that's different from the researchers and the intellectual property generators, and it's obviously an agent that's different from the investor, they just become a block to essentially innovation and commercialization. And I think that's a lesson for all TTOs. They've got to represent their stakeholders. They're there to try and make deals happen and to try and look after the intellectual property, the real intellectual property generators. So that's just a personal perspective. I saw some more hands, and I think we have maybe room for one, maybe two more questions.
Hi, my name is Dr. Matthew Muir. I wear two hats. I'm a co-founder of a pet food company, so I'm quite focused on nutrigenomics and precision nutrition. I'm also an integrative veterinarian here in Sydney, so I practice herbal medicine, conventional medicine mixed together. I also do cancer vaccines for dog patients. My question is, do any of you think about how, excuse me, we can revalue IP and start thinking about repurposed drugs or tapping into and unlocking things like herbal medicine and nutrition, where it's just been traditionally very difficult with IP and with huge costs and inefficiencies to get new drugs, which I completely support the need for more drugs. Should we be looking elsewhere in biotechnology?
It's a Good question. And anyone, Liz, you can.
Well, I think, I mean, repurposed drugs is an interesting area, and definitely, you know, there is a space for it. I think this is where AI can probably really, you know, even in COVID, you know, looking at what existing drugs were out there and how, you know, AI could actually look at, well, what would, you know, what existing drugs actually might have an impact on the spike protein. So I think that, you know, that area is interesting. Obviously, it comes with less risk, but probably less sexy. I don't know, for an investor, for a pharma company, maybe for sort of a founder, CEO. But in terms of animal health, I mean, that's a really interesting area. We, even at Argenica, we look at, you know, some of the application of our drug in animal health, and, you know, obviously from a commercial point of view, easier to get those things on market if there's a sufficiently clear sort of pathway as well. So, but yeah, the repurposed drug side, definitely opportunity. Investors I know in Australia do like it, and you see a number of sort of listed companies that have repurposed drugs because they are de-risked essentially from a safety point of view. So definitely opportunity.
If I'm going, and the organisers can tell me if I think I have to wrap up, judging by this clock here that just hit 0. So sorry if you had another question, but catch any of these guys. I would just like to personally thank all 3 of you for spending your time with us. Really appreciating your expertise. So join me in thanking Liz, Reid and Alice, please.